Wait, this is not just an apology. This is the moment everything flips. The power shifts and nothing will ever be the same again. Watch till the end because what happens next will completely change how you see this story. And hit subscribe right now for more real breakdowns you do not want to miss. You ever sit down to watch something thinking you already know how it is going to play out? Thinking you have seen this pattern before, heard these words before, felt this tension before, and yet somehow this moment still pulls you in deeper than you expected. Because what is unfolding here is not just another conversation, not just another attempt at making things right, but something far more layered, something that carries years of unspoken feelings, unresolved tension, and a reality that can no longer be avoided. And right from the start, there's this quiet weight hanging in the air, a sense that what is about to happen is important, not because of what is being said, but because of what is no longer being accepted. And that is where everything begins to shift. Because as he starts to speak, you can almost feel the direction he wants to take this in. He wants to soften the edges. He wants to present the past in a way that feels reflective, almost poetic, like he is trying to frame everything as part of a bigger picture, something meaningful, something that shapes them into who they are today. But the problem with that approach is that it does not fully acknowledge the reality of what actually happened. And that disconnect becomes more and more obvious with every word. Because while he's speaking from a place that feels distant, almost like he's narrating a story, she's sitting there, grounded in the truth of what she experienced. And those two perspectives cannot exist in the same space without friction. And that friction is what starts to build the tension, because you can tell that this is not going to land the way he expects it to land. You can sense that the impact he's hoping for is not going to come, because the person he is speaking to is no longer the person who once needed his words in the same way. And that is the part that changes everything. Because when someone has moved on, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, and even in how they see themselves, the dynamic shifts completely. And that shift is something he does not seem to fully understand yet, because he is still approaching this conversation as if there is something left to fix, something left to restore, something left to reconnect. But what he does not realize is that from her perspective, that chapter has already been closed, and not in a dramatic, explosive way, but in a quiet, steady way that comes from finally reaching a point where you no longer seek validation from the same place that once defined you. And that is what makes this moment so powerful, because it is not about confrontation. It's not about raising voices or proving a point. It is about the undeniable presence of growth and the way that growth changes everything, even the way you listen, even the way you respond, even the way you sit across from someone who once played a major role in your life and now no longer holds that same space. And as he continues to talk, there's this underlying sense that he believes he is offering something valuable, something meaningful, something that should be received in a certain way. But what he is actually offering feels incomplete, because it does not fully address the impact of his actions. It does not fully take responsibility for the hurt that was caused. And without that foundation, the words begin to lose their weight. They start to feel more like an explanation than an apology, more like a reflection than an acknowledgement. And that is where the disconnect becomes impossible to ignore. Because an apology is not just about expressing thoughts, it is about recognizing the effect those actions had on someone else and showing that you understand that impact in a real and honest way. And that is the piece that feels missing here. And as a viewer, you can feel it. You can sense that something is not quite landing the way it should, because while the words may sound thoughtful on the surface, they do not carry the depth that the situation requires. And that is what keeps the tension alive, because you are watching someone try to reshape a narrative while the other person has already stepped outside of it. And that difference creates a kind of silent resistance, a kind of unspoken boundary that does not need to be explained because it's already clear in the way she listens, in the way she responds, and even in the way she does not react the same way she might have in the past. And that is where the real story begins to unfold, because this is no longer about what happened back then. It's about what is happening right now in this moment. It's about the realization that growth changes how you engage with the past. It changes what you accept, what you question, and what you no longer allow to define you. And that is exactly what we are witnessing here. A moment where the past is being presented one way, while the present reality quietly but firmly refuses to be reshaped. And that refusal is not loud, it's not aggressive, it's not even directly stated. But it is there in every pause, every measured response, every moment where the expected reaction does not come. And that is what makes this so compelling, because it shows that sometimes the most powerful response is not in what you say, but in what you no longer feel the need to entertain. And that is the shift that he is now facing, whether he realizes it or not, because the dynamic he once understood no longer exists. The influence he once had no longer holds the same power, and the person he is trying to reach is no longer standing in the same place she once was. And that is something that cannot be undone with words alone. It cannot be rewritten through reflection. It can only be acknowledged. And that acknowledgement is what has yet to fully happen. And until it does, this conversation will continue to carry that same underlying tension, that same sense of something unresolved, something unfinished, something that keeps you watching because you know there is more beneath the surface, and you are waiting to see if it will finally come to light. What makes this moment even more intense is not just what is being said, but what is being revealed underneath it. Because as the conversation continues, there is this growing awareness that the gap between them is far wider than either of them is openly acknowledging. And that gap is not just about time or distance, it is about perspective, it is about understanding, and more importantly, it is about the reality that one person has already done the work of letting go, while the other is only just beginning to process what was lost. And that difference creates a tension that is impossible to ignore. Because while he continues to speak as if this is a shared reflection, she is listening from a place that is no longer emotionally tied to the outcome. And that shift changes everything. It changes the weight of his words, it changes the expectation behind them, and it completely alters the dynamic of the conversation. Because what he seems to be offering is something he believes will bring a sense of resolution, something that will allow both of them to look back and say that despite everything, there was something meaningful, something worth appreciating, something that can be remembered in a positive light. But what he fails to recognize is that for her, that stage has already passed, that reflection has already happened, and it did not require his input, it did not require his validation, and it certainly did not require this moment to reach that conclusion. Because when someone has truly moved forward, they are no longer waiting for the other person to catch up. They are no longer holding space for explanations that come too late, and they are no longer seeking closure from the same source that once caused the need for closure in the first place. And that is the reality that sits quietly between them as he continues to talk. Because while his words may be carefully chosen, while they may carry a tone that suggests thoughtfulness and reflection, they still revolve around his perspective, his experience, his interpretation of what everything meant, and that is where the imbalance becomes clear. Because an apology that centers the speaker rather than the person who was affected can never fully land the way it is intended to, and that is exactly what is happening here. Because instead of directly addressing the hurt, instead of clearly acknowledging the specific ways in which his actions impacted her, he leans into a broader, more abstract narrative, one that feels safer, one that avoids the discomfort of taking full responsibility. And while that approach may feel easier in the moment, it ultimately weakens the message because it leaves too much unsaid, too much unacknowledged, and too much open to interpretation. And that is why the response on the other side feels so different, because she is no longer engaging from a place of needing clarity. She already has that clarity. She is no longer looking for answers. She has already found them within herself. And that independence shifts the entire tone of the interaction, because now the conversation is no longer about reconciliation, it is about recognition. It is about whether or not he can truly see the situation for what it was, rather than what he wishes it was. It had been, and that is a much harder thing to do, because it requires a level of honesty that goes beyond surface-level reflection. It requires confronting the parts of the past that are uncomfortable, the parts that do not fit neatly into a narrative that can be easily accepted. And that is where he seems to struggle, because instead of stepping fully into that discomfort, he circles around it. He approaches it indirectly. He acknowledges pieces of it without fully embracing the weight of it. And that hesitation is what keeps the conversation from reaching the depth it needs to reach. Because without that full acknowledgement, there is always going to be a sense that something is missing, something important, something that prevents the moment from feeling complete. And as a viewer, you can feel that incompleteness. You can sense that there is more that needs to be said, more that needs to be understood. But at the same time, you can also see that for her, that need no longer exists, because she has already reached a place where she does not require that final piece to move forward. She has already built a sense of closure that is independent of this conversation. And that is what makes her presence so powerful in this moment, because she is not reacting out of emotion. She is not being pulled back into old patterns. She is simply observing, listening, and maintaining a level of composure that reflects just how much she has changed. And that change is what ultimately defines this interaction, because it highlights the contrast between where they are now and where they once were. It shows how growth can create distance even in the absence of conflict. And it demonstrates that sometimes the most significant shifts are the ones that happen quietly over time rather than in a single defining moment. And that is the deeper story unfolding here. Not just the attempt at an apology, but the realization that the relationship dynamic has fundamentally changed in a way that cannot be reversed. Because once someone reaches that level of clarity, once they redefine their sense of self, and once they establish boundaries that align with that new identity, there is no going back to the way things were. And that is the reality he is now facing, whether he fully understands it yet or not, because the space he once occupied in her life has been reshaped, it has been redefined, and it no longer functions in the same way. And that realization carries its own weight, its own impact, and its own sense of finality, because it marks the point where the past and the present can no longer be blended into a single narrative. They exist separately now, each with its own meaning, its own perspective, and its own sense of closure. And that separation is what ultimately brings this moment into focus, because it shows that while words can attempt to bridge the gap, they cannot undo the transformation that has already taken place. And that transformation is the true center of this story, the quiet but undeniable shift that changes everything, even when nothing is explicitly said. And just like that, everything changed, not with a fight, but with silence, growth, and the realization that some doors never reopen. If you made it this far, you already know this story hits different. So hit subscribe now and stay with me for the next breakdown. You will not want to miss what comes next.